My special guest today is an associate professor in the W.E.B. Du Bois Department of Afro-American Studies here at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. She is also an external faculty fellow at the Stanford Humanities Center and a National Endowment Humanities Fellow. Her most recent book, Department Stores and the Black Freedom Movement, Workers, Consumers, and the Civil Rights from the 1930s to the 1980s, was published by the University of North Carolina Press, and a copy of this book can be accessed on the link that I'm going to paste right in the description panel of this video, and in that on our Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook pages. Professor Traci, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
I'm so excited to have you. One thing I've seen on your CV here that you have received some support, some financial support, if not other forms of support from the Woodrow Wilson Foundation and the National Endowment Foundation as well. Can you just briefly describe what these initiatives are all about, what they fund, and how they can benefit young scholars?
Sure. So the first one was through the Woodrow Wilson Foundation. And so I was awarded that in 2018. It was actually a fellowship that was once called the Nancy Weiss Michael Junior Faculty Fellowship that supported, it supports assistant professors on their way to tenure. So in that case, I was awarded this fellowship and I ended up using it towards conducting some last minute research for the book, as a matter of fact, for the last chapter of this book. I spent the summer in College Park, Maryland, conducting research at the National Archives and Record Administration in College Park. And I was going through, at the time, the Sears affirmative action legal cases. And so that was fantastic because I was able to tie up the book and get tenure because of this. And not only that, the research that I had, it was so immense that some of it went in the book and then some of it went in a journal article that I published with the Journal of Women's History. And then the other, it's funny that I got both at the same time. So it was actually perfect and they complemented each other. So I used the National Endowment for the Humanities Fellowship, which at the time, that one was a summer stipend that I received. And so that also helped support me living away from Massachusetts and focusing my energies at the National Archives, really finishing up this book. I mean, it's been key. I currently have another one, a National Endowment for the Humanities Fellowship. That's not the summer stipend, that's the year-long fellowship, which has been tremendous because this has been allows me to focus my energies on this third book called Beyond Loving, Love, Sex, and Marriage in the Black Freedom Movement. And so with this, I've been able to spend some time out in California, some time in Texas, some time in DC. I've sort of been a little bit of everywhere working on this book that is really focusing on civil rights activists in the civil rights and the Black Power movement, but those who also had a foot in women's liberation, gay liberation, were impacted by the sexual revolution. So there's a lot of folks to cover, there's a lot of territory to cover, and this fellowship has been just a blessing.
So now getting to this book, Department Stores and the Black Freedom Movement, what would you consider to be the core ideas of the book? I want you to tell me the background against which you developed the idea for this book.
Sure. So the book itself considers the role of department store labor and consumption in the civil rights movement and the emergence of a modern Black middle class in the mid and late 20th century. And so by modern here, what I mean is a class identity grounded in consumer capitalism for which department stores were exemplars, right? Not industrial capitalism. And the story that I tell is important for understanding the economic dimensions, the agenda of the civil rights movement, because largely the civil rights movement is known for, or is well celebrated for ending public discrimination and segregation, right? We have also, as scholars, touted its effects in helping to end the psychological stigma of state-enforced racial classifications. So this is a reality that is also very much tied to public discrimination and segregation, right? It's exemplified in their ability to integrate eating facilities and other public accommodations. And so what I argue in this book is that the movement wasn't simply a single attack on Jim Crow, right? There is more of a broad-based attack on racial capitalism. Now, whether they succeed at this, and by they, I mean civil rights activists, is up for debate. I would say that they don't succeed at it, right? They succeed at critiquing it, but not dismantling it. But I think it's important to understand the work that labor does and consumption does in helping dismantle Jim Crow as we know it in the American South. As scholars, we tend to focus on labor. The argument has been made that labor was most important to the movement in the 1930s. And then again, somewhere in the 1960s, where there's this big gap. What I'm saying is that if you look at the way that African Americans mobilized in department stores and in other sites of consumption, both as laborers and consumers, you can see that while more overt efforts to integrate the economic sphere may have ended because of the rise of communism, that it actually continues, and they do so covertly. So I tell this story in one chapter of this woman named Dorothea Davis. And Dorothea Davis was a waitress who worked at W.T. Grant's in Charlotte, North Carolina. Now, W.T. Grant's would be considered a discount department store, five and dime. But she worked as a waitress at the Black lunch counter. And she's there when the students, who are very much inspired by the Greensboro sit-in that happens on February 1st, 1960, decide they want to protest W.T. Grant's to integrate their lunch counter, right? W.T. Grant's was unlike the Woolworths in Greensboro, North Carolina, in that it had two different lunch counters, one for African Americans and one for whites. The one in Woolworths was just for whites, right? They decide they don't want to be separated. And I should be clear that the one that was for Black space, like all Jim Crow, was not equal. It was in the basement, it sold different types of food, the service was different. The one for white customers was on the ground level. It was, they sold the food on plates, the food was hot, there was some variety. And it's during this campaign that Davis meets these protesters and they start talking, right? It's the lunch counter that bridges them. The lunch counter is the thing that is sort of a marker of Jim Crow and separates Black people from white people in some ways. But it also becomes a moment in protest of uniting African American workers, consumers, at least within the store. And they start to share their different experiences and their concerns and desires. And they create this alliance. And because of their relationship with Davis, they add labor concerns to their agenda, to their list of demands. And as a result, not only do they integrate the lunch counter, right, that we see that's widely celebrated in the public eye, but they also integrate white collar work in the store. And so in the mid 20th century, white collar work was still something that was sales and clerical work were still classified as white collar labor. And so she gets promoted from waitress to sales worker, and she becomes the first African-American sales worker at W.T. Grant's in Charlotte. Now, management keeps this a secret because what they don't want to do is offend their preferred clientele, right, which are white middle-class customers. And they not only do they keep it a secret, is that when they first integrate, they put her in a department that had long been extinct. It was a lamp department in the basement of the store, in the way back. But the word circulates among African Americans in Charlotte, and they start bringing their purchases, no matter how small, down to her counter. So you'd have women taking their, little lipsticks, and they would take them all the way down to the store, and they start buying lamps from that department. Some of them knowing they don't even need lamps, right? This is all a show of support. This is the continuation of this worker-consumer alliance that you see within the Black community. And as a result, she becomes one of the top salespeople at W.T. Grant's. And then as a result, she gets promoted over time to better departments that provide some degree of status and prestige based on the types of goods she's selling, but also the location in which she is now in the store. And so I tell this story because I think it's important to understand that Jim Crow permeated every facet of American life.
Mm-hmm.
But it looks different depending on each facet. And African Americans were very smart and very and would research how it functioned in each space in order to figure out the most effective way of dismantling it.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So I should clarify. So what I mean by that is that in department stores, yes, they obeyed the tenets of Jim Crow, but department stores also said everybody was welcome to come in and shop.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Regardless of class, race, ethnicity, gender. Now, once you got in the store, you might be treated differently.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So in the case, as I just explained, in the case of African Americans, that means that you probably could shop in every other department in the store, but you could not be served at the lunch counter. Right?
Oh.
If you were a worker, you could
Mm-hmm.
work as a janitor, you could work as a maid, you could work as an elevator operator. They could work in positions that were considered menial, that were certainly service, that resembled the type of labor that resembled domestic labor in many ways. They were jobs where African Americans were to be seen and not heard. But they were not allowed to hold jobs in sales and clerical jobs. These were jobs that were still considered in the mid 20th century to be jobs that required some degree of training. And they were jobs that were where you were constantly interfacing with the public.
So now, can you just briefly describe what
Mm-hmm.
was unique about department stores in particular? I'm glad you have started that conversation just as you were about to end that first response. What was particular about department stores that make them an interesting area or tool of analysis in this particular time?
Yeah. So I think it's hard for us sometimes to imagine in 2022 why department stores, right? 2022, you go into a department store, they kind of all look the same.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
There's nothing, you don't walk into a department store and you don't feel necessarily glamorous, I'm sure. But department stores for the better part of the 20th century, so I'm going to say the first 60 years, right? Maybe 70. They were places to see and be seen, right? They were the cutting edge of modernity. So department stores grew out of what we know as to be dry goods stores or plantation stores, right? These are one-room shops where you would walk in and you would place your order to somebody behind the counter. They would grab it and give it to you. Department said, we're going to do something different with consumers, right? They were huge, right? They were of unprecedented size, unprecedented opulence. They were located in downtown centers, right? They confronted customers with both an astounding array of high quality, stylish merchandise, but also lavish services, right? These are things, the type of service that you received are, you would walk in and people just automatically catered to you. Right? Saleswomen were trained to help you pick out an entire middle-class lifestyle, right? From your clothes to your shoes, to your furniture, to even the teacups you had in your house. And we're talking about sales workers who are not middle class like their clientele, although merchants hoped they could get middle class saleswomen, and they did when they could, right? We're talking, and these are white middle class women I'm talking about. But these are usually white working class women of ethnic background, although merchants preferred native born, who were even trained to speak a little bit of French, like throw in a word of French here and there to make customers feel like this is glitzy, glamorous, right? And so these were women who were mastered in the art of creating and satisfying customers' personal desires and indoctrinating them with the belief that an urban middle-class lifestyle could be realized and flaunted through shopping. Department stores, unlike the ones that we see today, with a few anomalies, offered numerous services and amenities. So customers, primarily white middle-class women, could spend the entire day there. So that meant that under one roof, you could find clothes, furniture, you could get a restaurant, there would be a piano player if you want to sit and listen to music. There were tea rooms, there were hair salons, there were barbershops, there were nurseries for children, there was a bus service, there was shoe shining, there was a hospital in some. The idea was that you got there first thing in the morning, you dropped your kids off, and you just didn't leave. And they made it comfortable for you to shop. So it wasn't like you would go and you would purchase your items. It's not like you're walking around with bags, right? And these are the higher end department stores. You're walking around, you would purchase your items and then they would deliver them to you. So there's this interesting story in an employee magazine where a woman orders just a spool of thread and has it delivered to her home. It's that type of catering that happens in department stores. Now there's different types of department stores over time, but the early ones are the more grand, opulent ones that are using new technology. So we're talking about electric lighting. We're talking about the use of glass. So glass, they would put the merchandise in glass counters so you could look over, you know, like what we're used to seeing now when you go into the jewelry department or something. The merchandise was in reach for customers to feel the fabric, to pull it, to see if they liked it. But always you had a sales worker there to sort of guide you through the process.
So focusing on just the fifth chapter, what were the differences, if there are any differences, between stores in Washington and Charlotte and other cities outside the South? And does this change when department stores outside of cities is considered?
Yeah, so it's an excellent question. So each department store had its own policy. So it's hard to make a distinction between region, at least when you're within the South, right? So it's hard to make a distinction between, it's interesting that DC is considered a Southern city by some because of its racial history. It's certainly below the Mason-Dixon line, so it makes it a Southern city. There are many Northern aspects of DC that makes it very different from a Charlotte or even a Mississippi, right? A Jackson, Mississippi. The difference I would say between the department stores is that oftentimes it's the eating areas that make it a difference, right? So in Northern department stores, they start to integrate their eating facilities earlier. Some don't have they don't have a racial policy when it comes to their eating facilities. That doesn't mean that they welcomed African Americans. That just meant that on the books, there wasn't a policy that said no Blacks, right? You're not going to walk in and find a sign that says white only. Instead, they found other ways to make African Americans uncomfortable from eating there, right? Maybe the service is slow. Maybe they don't wait on them fast enough. Maybe that while they don't take their reservations, you know what I mean? They lose their reservations, something of the sort. But in the South, oftentimes what is characteristic when it comes to department stores is that their eating facilities regularly excluded African Americans, right? This comes from a history where Jim Crow is believed, or racial taintness is believed to be biological, right? This is something that comes after slavery, that African Americans are diseased. And so there shouldn't be the mixing of Blacks and whites. But it's also the feeling that the assumption among retailers that white people only wanted to be around white people, right? That any presence of African Americans who were not in service positions made that space less glamorous, right? Less prestigious, not with status. And so the eating facilities become a continuation of the rest of the department store, right? And I should be clear that department stores are constructed in the late 19th, early 20th century with white people in mind, with white middle-class people in mind. And it's selling them, as one historian has called them, a fairyland of whiteness, right? Department stores are not only a place of class making, as I mentioned about buying a middle-class lifestyle, but it's also a place of race making. So this is a place where white people affirm their whiteness. If you were ethnic white, you could get the sense that because of the racial line, you could somewhat erase elements of your ethnicity, right? And make claim to this notion of whiteness as articulated within an American United States milieu, just in these four walls of the department store. So you're not just consuming a middle-class lifestyle, you're consuming and displaying a white middle-class lifestyle. And so in these eating rooms, in the eating facilities, whether it's the tea room, which, I don't think your generation would be familiar with, these are those fancy places where people really want to go have tea. I mean, it feels very British, like to some degree. Like a lot of elements of department stores are drawn from European department stores, it's particularly Paris ones. So you have a tea room, you'd have restaurants, you'd have the lunch counter, where white Americans are served by white Americans. If they're served by African Americans, these are African Americans that for a particular class of white Americans, they would find in their home working as domestics, right? A butler, a maid. And so that's the difference with Southern department stores. Baltimore, for example, there's some department stores who felt like they were progressive because rather than exclude African Americans from the lunch counter, African Americans weren't permitted to sit at the lunch counter. They could order from the lunch counter and then they could eat their food at like a little round stand-up table in the corner. But it's always very clear that there's a distinction, right? That there is a hierarchy of races and with whites always on top, right? That's always being confirmed in some way in the department store. Now there are slippages, which make the department stores a wonderful place to protest, right? Because it's not only a place where Jim Crow is present and it obeys certain tenets of the Jim Crow, but it's also a place that celebrates democracy. And so it's that contradiction that allows African Americans to push for changes in ways that was more difficult to do in other sites of consumption or in even other sites of other workplaces.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Professor Traci. I'm afraid we're running out of time, but thank you so much for giving this interview. Viewers and listeners, this was Professor Traci Parker. She is an associate professor in the W.E.B. Du Bois Department of Afro-American Studies here at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, and she is also an external faculty fellow at the Stanford Humanities Center and the National Endowment Humanities Fellow. Her most recent book, Department Stores and the Black Freedom Movement, Workers, Consumers, and the Civil Rights from the 1930s to the 1980s, was published by the University of North Carolina Press, and a copy of this book can be accessed on the link that I'm going to paste right in the description panel on the upload for this video and on our Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook pages. Professor Traci, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much and have a good day.
Thank you, you too.